So I'm here with Gordon Crovitz, who's the former publisher of the Wall Street Journal, now working a great deal with companies in Silicon Valley to hear about the difficulties, the strengths, weaknesses. How can Silicon Valley companies work with traditional publishers? How do traditional publishers look at Silicon Valley? What's the best way they can figure each other out?
Yeah. So, hi, greetings, Tom. So there's this great saying in Silicon Valley that whenever there's a change in technology that affects consumer behavior, we always tend to overestimate the impact in the short term, but then underestimate the impact in the long term. I think we're all seeing now that the digital revolution is for real. Usage of digital media is only increasing. The good news, I think, for traditional media companies is there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity and innovation now going on, marrying interesting software with traditional media. So there are efforts, for example, to help people overcome information overload by finding news that people like you found interesting, or being able to follow particular news leaders or news makers to see what it is that they have found interesting as they've perused the web to find information that they use. So I'm an advisor, in full disclosure, to socialmedian.com, which is one of these startups that is trying to address this kind of issue. Check it out. It's, I think, going to be useful to consumers, but also I think can be quite valuable to traditional media companies as providing another way for people to find really interesting content, really interesting journalism.
From the point of view of a Silicon Valley company looking to be attractive to or work with a major media company such as Dow Jones or any other one, what is some advice you'd give them?
Yeah, so first keep in mind that those traditional companies have an expense line called journalism or content production that traditional technology-based companies don't have. And so the mindset can be a little bit different. But I think we are at this really interesting period now where the technology is at a stage where the expenses are so low that there can be a lot of experimenting, a lot of innovation around software to add value to the content. I think we all know that content delivered in the right context is so much more valuable than content just thrown out to see if somebody will find it. And we are still at the early stages of finding ways to use digital technologies to deliver content in really helpful ways to consumers. But I think it's a very interesting time where Silicon Valley and traditional media companies more and more are working together to solve common problems.
What is the best way for a traditional media company to come to Silicon Valley? Go in and buy a new startup, or what is the best tactic?
Yeah,
and how can they identify them?
Yeah, I think just pay very close attention to what's going on. Try to stay close to it. Some traditional media companies are investors, sometimes seed investors in startup companies, partly as an investment and partly as a way to be sure they stay on top of technology. I think that's very smart.
Are there any websites in particular that you look at to follow news in this zone?
I'm also an investor in Silicon Alley. I would recommend you take a look at that. But I think all of us now have traditional media sources we look at, as well as newer media sources in the sort of business of how do you monetize digital content. Paidcontent.org, I think, has made a very good name for itself and showing how a B2B publisher really can operate in a digital way. The All Things D website from the Wall Street Journal, Walt Mossberg, Carl Swisher, I certainly read every day. And I think in every vertical niche there are more and more sources for information. And really the challenge now is how do we all locate that information and consume it in as consumer-friendly a way as we can. And there I think we really are still at an early stage in the development of digital technology.
You just mentioned a little while ago that in the US you can judge how many people read a product online versus in print basically by their age. 30% of 30-year-olds read online, read the print edition, 50% of 50-year-olds in the US. Is there going to be a crossover point where the money that can be obtained from these people reading online reaches that of where it is now, or are we facing a seminal shift in media that is going to be unsustainable for a lot of these media companies?
Yeah. I think for a lot of metro newspapers in the U.S., the experience really is, your peer group age is about the percentage of people who read the newspaper. So the older people, 70-year-olds, about 70% of people read newspapers. Younger people, much lower percentage. And I think newspapers, at least in the U.S., metro papers have had a hard time moving away from the model of packaging a version of what happened yesterday. The problem with that these days is people know what happened yesterday. People are very wired. They're getting information 24/7. The role for a daily print product, from my point of view, is synthesize the previous day's news, lean forward in terms of what people should look for in the next 24 hours. And I think if newspapers can do that, they can begin to attract again some of the younger people. But inevitably, I think all of us, but especially digital natives, especially younger people, will be getting by far the bulk of their information from various digital forms.
Finally, you have been very involved in international publishing, English language publishing in particular, both in Asia and in Europe. What is your take on the future for English language publishing in these overseas markets?
I think there's certainly a role for English language regional publishing in Asia and Europe and other regions. I think the situation is very different from a generation ago when the domestic media in many parts of the world were not free. They're now much more free than they were, where they're very sophisticated, whereas a generation ago much less sophisticated. That requires a different kind of publishing than in the past. But I do think that there's a continuing role for regional publishing, especially to a community of interest, business publishing, for example, and some other communities of interest where English happens to be the lingua franca in a region and enables people to communicate with one another.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure, Tom.